The title of my presentation is Q Bono, Who Benefits? I'm not going to read it. I'm going to simply speak to some of the points, but I believe you've all received it in both official languages. At the invitation of the Speaker of the House of Commons, Yaroslav Hunka was present in the House during the visit to Canada of President Volodymyr Zelensky. When it was subsequently reported on left-wing blogs that Mr. Hunka had served in the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, more commonly referred to as the Galicia Division, a controversy erupted which has continued to fester to this day. Now, there are a few things I want to point out right at the start. I don't know Mr. Hunka. I've never met him. Secondly, my mother was kidnapped as a teenager and brought to the Third Reich as a slave laborer during the Second World War. So I have absolutely no interest in defending any Nazi who may still be alive. Let's be very clear about that. I was, however, also a member of the Civil Liberties Commission, representing the Ukrainian Canadian community during the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals. So I think I'm one of the only people in this room who was there and was part of the investigation that examined the allegations that thousands of Nazi war criminals had somehow managed to get into Canada. I was present in the lockdown with the Minister of Justice, Raymond Hatishin, when he revealed the Commission's findings to the Baltic Jewish and Ukrainian communities. And along with a representative of the Canadian Jewish Congress, Erwin Kotler, whom you all know, I appeared on the CBC program The Journal with Barbara Frum on the 12th of March, 1987, and welcomed the findings of the Deschênes Commission. Now, at that time, our community had a suspicion that Soviet agents and their fellow travelers in their West had provoked this controversy over alleged presence of thousands of Nazi war criminals in North America. Only recently, we have actually come up with a documentary evidence. There was a 1985 KGB document describing something called Operation Payback, which was a disinformation campaign started in the 1970s and intended to stoke tensions between the Jewish, Baltic, and Ukrainian diasporas. That subterfuge worked very well at the time, and it works well to this day. In fact, it is now being deployed to distract attention from Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine and Ukrainians. Now, I'm not going to go into the position of the Ukrainian Canadian community on bringing war criminals to justice. That's already been explained. Unfortunately, Canada has never properly investigated how alleged Soviet and communist war criminals and collaborators managed to get into this country, and some did. Even individuals who openly boasted what they had done on behalf of the Stalinist regime in the ranks of the NKVD, SMERSH, and KGB. Government records about all those persons should also now be made available. Now let's look at the evidence with respect to Mr. Hunka. First of all, Mr. Hunka was never a Nazi. He was never a former Nazi. No Ukrainian could ever be a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, because Ukrainians, like all other Slavs, were considered to be subhumans. They weren't Aryans, they were subhumans, Untermenschen, so they could never be Nazis. Now, every individual who served in the armed forces of the Third Reich during the Second World War, and that's millions of people in total, were obliged to swear an oath to Adolf Hitler. That obviously did not make them all into Nazis, including about 250,000 Germans who immigrated to Canada in the 1950s. Now, indisputably, Mr. Hunka served with the Galicia Division. So why? Why did he enlist? I found a letter in my research that he wrote on the 22nd of September, 2015, so years before there was any controversy about him. And in that, he provides an explanation about why he joined. He volunteered. As a young man, as a teenager in Western Ukraine during the first Soviet occupation of that region between mid-September 1939 and late June 1941, Mr. Hunka witnessed massacres perpetrated by the Soviets against innocent civilians. He witnessed the deportation of family members to Siberia, where some of them died. And so, as he wrote, I learned to hate the Russians. That's what he wrote years ago. Now, he joined, he served to the end of the war. He was interned in Rimini in northeastern Italy after the war, and we'll come to that, back to that in a moment. When the Deschênes Commission in 1985 through 1987 investigated the issue of alleged Nazi war criminals in Canada, it came to a number of specific conclusions about the Galicia Division, which everyone seems to have forgotten. One was that the Galicia Division, should not be indicted as a group. Two, that members of the division had been screened, and indeed they were screened by the British, by the Americans, by the Canadians, including people I personally knew, and even by the Soviets. And charges of war crimes against members of the division were never substantiated. And in the absence of knowledge or evidence of specific war crimes, Mr. Justice Deschênes said mere membership in the Galicia Division is insufficient to justify prosecution. He also concluded that because these people had come to Canada after 1950 with the full knowledge of the government of Canada, Canadian authorities are aware who these men were, they could not have their citizenship revoked because it had been granted to them normally through the naturalization process. What does all that mean with respect to Mr. Hunka? It means simply that he came to Canada legally in 1954. His wartime record with the Galicia Division was well known. No one complained. Now, there were, understandably, and I'm going to underscore that, concerns raised by the Canadian Jewish Congress in 1950, in the autumn of 1950. Who are these people? Why are they being allowed to come to Canada? And in fact, the government at the cabinet level asked the High Commissioner for Canada and the United Kingdom, Eldana Wilgrist, to investigate this. And he did. And he dismissed those allegations about the Galicia Division as being nothing but communist propaganda. And I quote, and he also added in his report to Cabinet, and I quote, "It is interesting to note that no specific charges of war crimes have been made by the Soviet or any other government against any member of this group," end of quote. That rather astute assessment seems to have been forgotten. So, what am I here to do today? As I said, I don't know Mr. Hunka. But when I look at the facts of his life, here's what I find. As a teenager, he fought in defense of Ukraine because of what he had witnessed the Soviets do to Ukrainians between 1939 and 1941. He had nothing to do with the persecution of any minority group. At the war's end, he became a prisoner of war. Later, he became an immigrant, and finally, a naturalized Canadian citizen. He served in the Canadian Army, in the militia from 1963 to 1965, and he swore an oath to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. He worked hard. He raised a family, he paid his taxes, he broke no laws that I'm aware of in Canada, and he contributed for 70 years to the general welfare of his adopted country. And yet, disregarding the principles of natural justice, many members of Parliament, members from all parties, denounced Yaroslav Hunka for being something he never was, a Nazi. The fundamental principle of our justice system, ladies and gentlemen, is that a person is innocent until proven guilty. Given that there is no evidence of any kind, of any wartime criminality on the part of Mr. Hunka's part, I'd like to say that the House of Commons owes an innocent man and our fellow Canadian a public apology. Thank you.
Could you speak to the propaganda that was actually perpetrated by the House reaction by some members more than others that actually were used by Russia?
I can say that I had a friend, Stefan Petulitsky, 154922 was his Auschwitz tattoo number. I helped him prepare his memoirs for publication, and they're now available. And so I heard a great deal about what happened at Auschwitz and by whom and to whom. And from people like that and the people I interviewed for my doctoral dissertation, I learned not to pick sides. And so I'm not going to pick sides on that question. I will say that I was disappointed as a Canadian of Ukrainian heritage by the reaction of many members in the House of Commons from all parties. And I have a list of quotations here from every party, I made sure. I'm not going to read those into the record, but the point is, it was a knee-jerk reaction. You were all on a high because President Zelensky had come here, and we all recognize him as Ukraine's Moses. This is a man who's leading his people, his nation, the Ukrainian nation, himself of Jewish heritage, out of Russian Soviet bondage. This is what he's doing, and this is why Putin's pushing back so hard. Putin's the pharaoh. He's just made himself immortal in terms of the quote-unquote election. He's going to be there longer than Stalin. So we have a Ukrainian president who's here. You all welcomed him. You all applauded him. And in that euphoria, a man was introduced from North Bay in a wheelchair, wearing an embroidered Ukrainian shirt, who just wanted to see his president, for whom he fought in the sense that he fought for Ukraine's independence. And then the next day, the left-wing press got onto it and said, oh, he's an SS man, and then people ran with it. There wasn't a single media report that I could find that took a different position. Not one. There wasn't a single member of parliament who paused and thought and said, maybe I should read a book. Maybe I should think about this. Now, most of you are a lot younger than me. And the reality of it is, you might not know these things, but everyone rushed to condemn because it's so easy to say SS man, Nazi. Someone even elevated him to an SS officer. I mean, he got promoted by the MP who said that. Mr. Hunka was never a Nazi. There's no evidence he did anything wrong. He's an innocent Canadian, and yet he was condemned. And he was condemned by people in every party. So please, drop the partisan part of this. How do you get beyond this? And that was part of both of your questions. You get beyond this by thinking before you speak. You get beyond this by not falling prey to Soviet disinformation regurgitated by the Russian Federation and their operatives in Canada and their fellow travelers, of whom there are more than a few. They're very good at this, and they suckered you.
Just a question following that line. We're seeing the propaganda increase. We're starting to see now a campaign on Facebook and others. They're starting to say, just got my taxes done in Canada. I owe Ukraine $14,000. Do you see the harmful rhetoric being incurred against, sorry, Professor Luciuk, just following on your last comment, the harmful rhetoric that is increasing in this country on Russian propaganda?
Yes, both in the United States and in Canada, these kinds of reactions are occurring, and they're very harmful. Ukraine is literally fighting against the genocidal agenda of the KGB man in the Kremlin, and we need to do everything we can to support Ukraine now because Ukraine is fighting for the free world. And I think we all know that. Conservatives, liberals, New Democrats, Green Party, we all know that. So support Ukraine. Don't fall for Soviet Russian disinformation.